Okay, yeah. I mean, maybe we should make a start, brother Abdullah. What do you think? You ready to make a start?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Alhamdulillah, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Welcome back for our Friday circle, our regular Friday circle today. Really pleased to be joined by our brother Abdullah today. Who's going to be talking to us a little bit about the Black Lives Matter movement and where we are now. So I think we had a talk on kind of Black Lives Matter a couple of weeks ago, actually. No, a few weeks ago. So I think sounds like a really good kind of follow up to the one we had a few weeks ago, inshallah. So I think that's all I wanted to say. I think, Brother Abdullah, you're going to talk to us for maybe about 15, 20 minutes-ish, and then, if anyone wants to ask any questions, I'm sure we can take those as well. So just put them in the comments box wherever you're watching, and we can get around to them. So I think that's all I need to say. So over to you, Brother Abdullah.
بارك الله فيك، جزاك الله خير. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. My name is Abdullah. I'm one of the organizers for the Sheffield Black Lives Matter group, and we organized a protest on the 6th of June in relation to the death and murder of George Floyd, and to basically campaign for justice for Black people, not just in the UK, not just in the US, but also in the UK. So today I just want to give like a brief introduction on a little bit on this civil rights movement / Black Lives Matter, and what kind of things would be great to see in the long run. So for me, I was a former president of the Students' Union at Sheffield Hallam University, and also I was involved with the Islamic Society as well. So in terms of like, firstly, I just want to thank you for the invite as well. That's really much appreciated, and we hope in the long run we can work more closely when it comes to the social justice campaign. So the civil rights movement itself basically was a struggle for social justice that took place mainly in the 1950s and 1960s for Black Americans to gain equal rights in the United States. And then the Civil War officially abolished the slavery, but obviously that still continues to this day in different forms. But it didn't end discrimination against Black people. Unfortunately, Black people continued to endure destructive effects of racism, especially in the South. And by the mid-20th century, Black Americans had more than enough of prejudice and violence against them. They, along with allies, mobilized and began to basically a record for fight of equality that crossed over 2 decades. And that relates to the Black Lives Matter movement and its formation. And the Black Lives Matter itself, a group formed in the US initially in 2013 after the death of the 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in 2012. But the kickoff for the protest and the campaign behind the Black Lives Matter occurred after the murderer of Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman, was acquitted, and that sparked many protests, riots, and Trayvon Martin's death was it awakened the very latent, suppressed civil rights movement itself, and it brought into life a new kind of movement in a sense. So the death of George Floyd itself, though, also to add, the death of Trayvon Martin did also include campaigns in the UK itself. It wasn't just in the US. And how now we have like the BLM UK, we have the coalition groups, we have different groups within the Black Lives Matter movement itself. It's not just one set group. But the death of George Floyd actually is something rather new, and reminds us of the death of Eric Gardner in a sense. Not in a sense that it's a new thing. It's been happening, unfortunately, and Eric Gardner's death was just a reminder of that. Who died in New York after an officer put him down in a chokehold whilst arresting him despite chokeholds being banned in the NYPD since 1993. But video footage of the incident created widespread of national and international attention to the murder of Eric Gardner. And, this relates to the death of George Floyd as well, in some sense. The death of Eric Gardner raised many questions in terms of the appropriate use of force by the law enforcement, with like multiple officers, especially pinning down Eric Gardner. This is not the first time also that Eric Gardner was harassed by the police. And actually in the footage, you can hear him saying to the police that he's tired of being harassed continuously, and that he wasn't selling cigarettes, which was the reason that the arrest took place in the first place, which was nonsense. Obviously, with several officers pinning Eric Gardner down, he repeated the words, "I can't breathe." And so that's in relation to people using the hashtags of "I can't breathe" or mentioning it in protest, in speeches. So he mentioned it 11 times while he was lying down, whilst his face was lying down on the sidewalks. And then Eric Gardner lost consciousness, and he remained lying there in the sidewalks for around 7 minutes. And the officers waited for an ambulance to arrive. But by the time the ambulance arrived, he was basically dead. And this is really essential because the grand jury decided to not indict any officer. And because they made this decision, this stimulated public protest and rallies with charges of police brutality made by the protesters. And by December 2014, there was at least 50 demonstrations that were being held in response to Eric Gardner's case, with like hundreds of demonstrations against police brutality in general. But Eric Gardner's death was like the vocal point to that in that year. And the U.S. Department of Justice actually declined to bring criminal charges against Pentilio, who is the person who killed Eric Gardner under federal civil rights law. But then the New York Police Department put through a disciplinary hearing regarding Pentilio's treatment, not death, treatment to Gardner, whilst it being held in summer 2019. That's basically more than 5 years after the death of Eric Gardner. A disciplinary hearing is taking place, and Pentilio was fired. That was pretty much it with Pentilio. In August 2014, though, Michael Brown Jr. was an 18-year-old person who was fatally shot by a 20-year-old white Ferguson police officer, Darren Wilson, in the city of Ferguson, which is known for many protests and riots to be taken place. That has been taking place, and unfortunately, Michael was shot in front of his body 6 times. And even though he put his hands up to surrender, the police still shot him and killed him. And obviously, this awakened like many protests as well. And when we hear the "hands up, don't shoot" slogans used at protests, that's in relation to more specifically to the killing of Michael Brown, surrendering and putting his hands up, but the officer still shooting. As if that wasn't not enough, in 2014, Tanisha Anderson, who had mental health issues, was in a period of mental instability, and her family called 911 for assistance. And police officers came and responded to her home. And even though Tanisha was not armed, she was not dangerous, and was not accused of committing any crime. She just needed mental health treatment. She was basically, it started off, the conversation between her and the officers was through a verbal control techniques, but then the officers quickly escalated that to physical force, and ultimately holding her on the ground, causing her respiratory system, causing her respiratory problems, and suffering from that, ultimately caused her death. And instead of calling the emergency services, the police called after 14 minutes from her death. Many people associate the Black Lives Matter movement closely with like the fatal shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson. But in many ways, Martin's death was the first that inspired a new generation of activists to take the streets and protest against a system that we feel and that they felt that the lives of um, Africans, Americans in small regard, and was in desperate need and call for change. And this brings us to the BLM in the UK and relates to the 25th of May when George Floyd was killed by cops in Minneapolis. And that sparked anti-racism protests. And I remember when I was watching his video of him being killed, it took me actually a couple of days for me to watch it, because obviously we had enough of seeing these videos of Black people being murdered and killed for just being Black, really. And so it was really sad and difficult. And I personally felt so much anger when I watched his video, the video of his death. George Floyd, unfortunately, was unlucky. Like a white police officer was kneeling for nearly 9 minutes on the unarmed Floyd windpipe. And this wasn't just happening during the night time or anything like that. This happened in broad daylight, and unfortunately crushing the breath and life out of him. And his death, has shown a turning point in the Black Lives Matter movement and links to the Black Lives Matter movement in Sheffield. So initially we started in 2016, and really the death of Sandra Bland, Alta Sterling, Philando Castile, and so many others as well in the UK, it raised concerns and people just had enough. And I think with the continuous death of Black and brown people, especially Black people on camera, the Black Lives Matter movement again started in 2020. Even though it was going on, I feel the movement died slowly and now came back again. And unfortunately has become more of a trend for some people rather than actually acknowledging the issues that we face in hand. And the protest, I'd say, was really surprising for me. I was really shocked. It was massive. We had approximately, within the first hour of the protest, it was around 3,000 people, 2,000 to 3,000 people. And by the end of the protest, it was around 5,000 people, or even probably more. So it did show a huge amount of anger. And I think this is in relation to the 9+ years of austerity that our societies have been feeling for a very long time. Inequalities, whether that's in education, whether that's in workplaces, the economy as a whole, the NHS, and with COVID-19 as well. You would have expected people to stay indoors, but because of the anger and frustration and people wanting change, you would have not thought. I didn't think we were, even when we were doing the risk assessment, we never thought we'd get the numbers that people showed up with. And I think it's important to recognize the issues that people are facing. And for us, it was really to raise awareness. While we organized the protest in Sheffield, was to raise awareness of what's going on in America, challenging policing in America, but also to draw attention to the one person a week that dies at the hands of police brutality or in prisons in the UK. And since 1990, there has been more than 1,743 people in England and Wales who have died following contact with the police. And since 1991, there hasn't ever been, as we recall, in the UK, where a police officer has been convicted. And we know that Black people are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched, but white people are more likely to be found with drugs when they're stopped by police. And we know this is a huge problem, for example, in Sheffield, where stop and search is a real issue in areas, for instance, of Bangreave, Broomhall more specifically. And just within the COVID-19 period, young people, young Black men were stopped and searched by police more than 200,000 times in London itself during the COVID-19 lockdown. And that's equivalent to more than a quarter of all black youngsters from the age of 15 to 24 in its capital. More than 80% of the 21,000 plus people that had been stopped and searched between March and May resulted in no further action. And this is according to the analysis by the Home Affairs Committee, Select Committee, chaired by Yvette Cooper. Official figures showed that, police in England and Wales were 3 times more likely to arrest a black person, than a white person, and 5 times more likely to use force. And that's in 2018-19. Stop and search, we know, disproportionately affects young black men and unfairly targets them, and it destroys basically police. It destroys the trust between police and the community that they are meant to serve. And between 2018 April and March 2019, in England and Wales, black people, including mixed race, were stopped and searched about in per rate capita 205 out of 1,000 people. And that's just approximate in terms of those who have identified themselves. It could potentially be a lot more. We know stop and search is a very ineffective system, as it doesn't reduce violent crime, and it's basically dependent, and it's used as a dependence rather than looking into what the root problems are in our society and addressing the root problems. Stop and search is there apparently to keep our community safer, but when stop and search occurs, it's mainly for small amounts of cannabis, and this is more of an harassment towards mainly young black boys. And policing is not the answer. Policing doesn't reform anything at all. And when we say, for example, defunding the police, what we mean is by that is, taking money and power away from the police and prisons and putting it back in the communities, rather than just putting more money in policing to solve problems where the answer is not policing the communities. Our communities don't need policing, they need investment, they need support. And I'll use the example of the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, who condemned demands basically to defund the police as nonsense on BBC Breakfast. And this, it shouldn't really be a surprise, especially with his past, but it does simulate a disappointment really from the criminal justice service reformers and supporters of the Black Lives Matter protest and just the group and the movement as a whole. And it dismisses basically the amount to a realistic and serious policy approach that this defunding the police actually means. And Starmer, for instance, leader of the Labour Party, ignores 2 important factors of this. One is that the policing has failed to improve public safety, and the other is that there's numerous and constructive alternatives to ineffective attempts to police away social problems, and campaigns to defund the police and prisons. It doesn't say that we don't want policing, or that every prison should close tomorrow, or that every officer should be sacked the day after. What it argues for is that social problems are better addressed through social responses. And even though policing and prisons have expanded over the last 30 years, there hasn't been an improvement when it comes to the public safety of people. And it's important to emphasize on basically how extensive the current existing funding for policing has become. UK or Britain has the second biggest policing budget funding per capita in Europe, and has some of the most wide-reaching and invasive public surveillance measures in the world, including police programs that have spied on organizations, over 1,000 organizations, including Black families that are campaigning against police racism, especially those who have lost family members due to police brutality. The cost of spying alone in the UK is approximately £17 million. And that's really difficult to basically quantify or justify the need for. And the government, a couple of weeks ago, they announced that 2.5 billion pounds basically is going to be spent on 4 new prisons to incarcerate 10,000 people. And the total cost of the UK criminal justice system, which includes policing, law courts, and prisons from in 2018-19, was costed of basically costed 28.6 billion pound. And that's more than what's been spent on primary school, primary education, more than what's been spent in social care, more than what's been spent in housing or environment, or even funding youth clubs, mental health services, women's refugee and educational projects. Um, and these are areas that the government needs to focus on in terms of public life that provides solutions to the problems that our society face. And that doesn't at all work by having more police or more prison system that failed already to improve. And when we say defunding the police, I have to like make this clear to people. It doesn't mean like immediate end to policing, but what it means is investing in social policies that prevent people who experience violence and who avoids people from experiencing violence and harm in the first place. And according to Unite, in 2012, more than 750 youth centers have been closed, in England and Wales, and over 4,000 youth workers have lost their jobs as well in England and Wales, and hundreds of thousands of young people who are vulnerable. Most of young vulnerable people, have been cut from vital resources like, having trusted adults to confide in, youth provisions, especially those who are at risk of violence, whether that's at home, with dangerous home environments, or even being pressured into into criminal activities. And interventions have to be accessible for young people before they encounter the criminal justice system. 2/3 of young people are diagnosed with mental health conditions, but don't have access to mental health services or have been turned away. And the government pushing for policies to have police permanently stationed at schools does not solve issues that occur in schools, and especially with kids who have special needs, or mental health problems, are usually the ones who experience school exclusions, but at the same time are overrepresented or overpopulated in prisons, leaving basically um, leaving them with not having mental health support they need or educational provisions, and it leaves the police to deal with the social issues that our society face. And neglecting young people's needs, and it uses them as criminals rather than actually seeing what the social problems are in the first place. Um, Even with reforms, training, inquiries in police racism, Black Britons make up 12% of adult prisoners and more than 20% of children in custody, and that's just compared to 3% of the general population. Amnesty International reported that anti-gang policing targets Black young people with no or little connection to crime. And when we say in the BLM movement, and I don't claim to be one, but just as an organizer, when we say that defunding the police, we don't just mean it as institutional racism, but also it's a demand of seeking tangible evidence and effective improvements to public safety, beginning with those who need it most, whether that's from domestic violence services to new social housing, and the restoration of educational maintenance allowance for those in post 16 education. And we know that racism is deep rooted in the foundation of this country, from housing to education, and the social justice system itself. And that's where we need to begin and focus on really. And the best way to basically tackle racism in our criminal justice system is to create safer communities for everyone, by reducing police powers and resources, and increasing capacity when it comes to health, social care, and the education system itself. In terms of the long run, what personally I'd like to see within the movement itself, it's many really, and it includes what's been mentioned above. But with that, we have to recognize what's already been achieved. from the BLM movement so far. So four of the officers involved in the George Floyd's murder have been arrested and charged, one of which, Derek Chauvin, appeared in court on June the 9th, and he was charged with second-class degree murder and second-degree manslaughter, and the other three were charged with aiding and um, assisting second-degree murder and manslaughter and second-degree manslaughter. The Minnesota Department of Human Rights filed also a civil rights charge against the Minneapolis Police Department because of their connection with the death of George Floyd. And we've seen also statues across the globe being, you know, broken down, torn down during anti-racist protests, one of which was the Edward Colston, a slave trader in Bristol. And although this was a historic moment, we see, if I'm not mistaken, around 10 to 18 people who have been recognized to be charged for contributing to, his statue being torn down. And another thing to mention, Sadiq Khan, the London mayor, launched a diversity commission to investigate basically what statues should be retained and ones that should be removed as well. So even though it may seem all gloom and doom, there has been some improvements, and quite rightly big improvements that has happened, and it shows that a lot can be done within the movement of the Black Lives Matter. And to be honest, I'd say the Black Lives Matter is integrated with the day-to-day social justice campaigns that are occurring. And we know, for instance, on June the 9th, the Democrats in Congress proposed legislation to reform American police, facilitating, the persecution of police for misconduct, ban chokeholds as well, and addressing racism. And Minneapolis police officials, agreed to ban the use of chokeholds as well. And the LA mayor as well, he pledged to redirect around $150 million to youth jobs, to health initiatives and peace centers. And that's according to the Los Angeles Times. So people are thinking about, removing police resource and putting it into, rightly, to be honest, to schools, to like the education system. And I think in the UK, that would be, for instance, investing into the NHS, investing in social housing, because many people, for instance, we know are homeless and require shelter. And UK being the sixth largest in terms of economy, and not being able to provide the very basic human rights for individuals or citizens in the UK, says a lot about the care from the government itself. In terms of Sheffield BLM, how we are organizing, currently we are working with organizations who are already on the ground. One to mention that personally I'm hoping in the long run we can work with is Unity Gym, and they support youngsters through sports and initiatives to basically have a clear mind goal in terms of where they want to head. We are aiming in the long run to be a hub for organizations, where we link organizations together. One of the things that has come out of the Black Lives Matter protests in Sheffield, I'd say, which is a success within itself, is the Independent Race Equality Commission that's coming soon. I understand in the next couple of weeks, which is really, really important in terms of, holding officials in the city accountable, but also, there's supporting the Black community who have been massively let down in Sheffield. And I think our position as Sheffield Black Lives Matter is to basically hold the officials, councillors, organizations with funding and resource to account, and ensure that, through our media platforms, but also through our work, that, we'll continue to campaign for the Black Lives Matter movement and, for the betterment of Black people. We have been working with organizations and groups as well. We've been part of the Shukriati protest, for example, and next week as well we're supporting the Yemen protest as well. So we do work with other groups as well that face injustice as well. Our priority, of course, is the Black Lives Matter movement and ensuring that Black lives have voices, young Black kids have voices as well, and tackling inequalities when it comes to schools, especially with Sheffield having one of the highest in England school exclusion. We know the Roma community is the highest, followed by the Black community, and it's something that we intend to challenge as a group, and we hope to see more people engage with that. As a young Muslim myself, I think what I would personally love to see more is for mosques as a whole to look into the accessibility and inclusion and involvement of the Muslim community that are within the Black Muslims within the community, who I've seen personally the treatment more generally nationally isn't great, and we need to move away as Muslim organizations in the UK and even elsewhere, a more united front when it comes to involving, you know, all of our Muslims from different diverse groups. I would love to see, for instance, as well, diversity when it comes to our speakers, when it comes to this is more general points from Masajid as a whole, nothing in terms of individual mosque, more of a general issue within the Muslim community is the racism within our own communities as well that we need to tackle and focus on, whether that's our trustees within mosques, our committee members, or even our demographic of attendees that come and pray in the masjid. We need to question ourselves and reflect and evaluate. Are we including not just the Black Muslim community, but because we're talking about Black Lives Matter movement in this session now, um, but including all our Muslim members of the community and seeing how we can reflect in ourselves. And I don't believe in this unconscious bias trainings. I feel they are just a tick box exercise, but I feel some sort of learning and educating ourselves about, you know, just generally our Muslim brothers and sisters and educating ourselves about our own privileges, but also about the uh, disadvantages that our other members of our community face. And I think that's something that in the long run, myself and my team would be happy to work with any group on that. Um, and I've been involved with my local masjid as well for a very long time. So I understand kind of how masajids work. And I think also in terms of one key interest for me personally as a young person is within our massages, how can we involve the youngsters? How can we get them more involved? And I think for me, I don't like to pick up people, but I definitely want to take this opportunity to pick up Ali really for inviting me to this because I think this is really important to get young people's voices, but also for his great work in involving the students from universities, but also young people in general. So massive shout out to yourselves for that. Um, I think I would like to leave it here for questions, and I believe I've gone over what I wanted to stick to timing, but unfortunately I didn't stick to timing. But I hope that we can have some sort of conversations, even if it's not now, but in the long run as well, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. And thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for that, Abdullah. Not a problem about going over. It was a really, really interesting talk. To be honest, personally, I've read and seen a lot about the Black Lives Matter movement, obviously over the last few weeks. But that's probably one of the most kind of comprehensive explanations I've seen of the kind of aims and objectives in the UK and the background. So really thank you for that. I think that was a really great talk. So if anyone does have any questions, you can put them in the comments wherever you are on Facebook, on YouTube, if you want to ask Abdullah anything. So I'll check back there and see if we've got any questions in the comments in a bit. I guess there's a few things that, like when you were talking, it triggered loads of thoughts in my mind, so yeah, I guess wanted to pick your brains on a few things really. So the first one was just on the aims and objectives of Black Lives Matter in the UK. So I think you talked a lot about police reform and the kind of criminal justice system, like understandably. To what extent is the kind of Black Lives Matter about that, and to what extent is it about kind of reform of the kind of wider structural racism things that we see in society? And is it kind of targeting both of those? Is it targeting, just the police reform? Kind of like what's your understanding of that?
I think it's a very good question. Thank you for that. I think in terms of the Black Lives Matter, because it's such a huge and massive movement and so many subgroups, during the organizing, before the organizing, I had no idea how diverse and big the different groups are within the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK, never mind the US itself. I think the main objectives of Black Lives Matter is to campaign and fight justice for Black lives, and to ensure that that they're alive and that they get the support they need, whether that's within the education system of I know from growing up seeing Black friends of mine being excluded for really minor things, or even like the racism within the classrooms, within the universities, and the attainment gap within the universities. For instance, Black and brown people within universities have a less likely chance of achieving a 2-1 or a first classification degree. And I think in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement as a whole, it's a very difficult to answer in terms of what, for instance, BLM UK are planning to do. But I think the main concerns is the killing of Black people, and that's why I think there's heavy focus and evident to the session that to what I was speaking about in terms of police reforming. There's a huge issue with that, and I feel, for instance, police being in schools. I remember being in school, and police officers were beginning to be more involved in schools, and from an early age, it gave opportunity for police to identify troublemakers rather than seeing the group issues and problems. So I think the aims for me personally that I would see the BLM UK, or not BLM UK, but just Black Lives Matter movement as a whole in the UK and the US, will be the police reforming, the education reform in terms of making sure that we have even the right people teaching the right things. For instance, we know in the UK there's a huge campaign on the decolonizing of the curriculum, or also known as the Where's My Curriculum Why campaign. And it's not to move away from Eurocentric viewpoints, but actually to accept and acknowledge the hard work and work in academia and scholarships of Black and brown academics as well. So I think when it comes to the education reform, I would say that definitely reevaluating the reading materials when it comes to the universities, when it comes to schools, the history lessons that are being taught. Black history is not just about slavery, and I think this is a huge error of judgment from schools, where they are not equipped in actually teaching the wider perspective of internationalism and globalism within the world. It is very close-minded, one-way path of teaching, and I think that is where the errors are. So I would say aims and objectives would be the reforms within education, the history lessons, what's being taught in our classrooms, the racist banter as well within the classrooms, the dealing with racism of young people. I know from my experience there are racist things that unfortunately my academics used to say in school, or even others, the racism that they face from their academics. So the disciplinary process of staff in schools. We know even many, when you look at Teach First or the students on the PGC course, it lacks individuals from the Black and brown communities, mainly due to the fact that they are made to feel as not worthy to be in the position that they're in, or treated differently for the color of their skin or their accent, or being able to speak multiple languages. So I feel it's a huge, broad issue. I think why the focus is mainly on police reform is because the main issue here from the name of Black Lives Matter is Black people being killed disproportionately because of police brutality because of racism within the police. And the Stephen Lawrence case taken more than 10 years to, even till today, not all of the murderers have, been convicted. And I think it says a lot in terms of how long we have to go. And I think it's not about how long we have to go, but what is the willingness for people to change? Because for this, racism in a way is a business for the elites to get the ways they need to get and divide and conquer communities, make communities feel that it's that person's fault that the economy is rubbish. It's that person's fault that people are overcrowded in schools or in classrooms. And I think that is what I feel we need to be heading as community organizers, whether that's through the Black Lives Matter movement or just generally in our day to day. And I think because there's a huge follow or there's a follow or followers within Muslim Welfare House of academics, of individuals who are doctors or have really contributed to society massively. I think for those people, what I would say to them is, continue doing the work you're doing, but also challenge, if you can, the inequalities within the workforce,
Yeah.
within the workplaces that
Yeah.
you're in, so that the younger generation, when they are in a position to be in the position that you are at, it's more accessible, it's more easy. And I feel, even though there's a long way to go, I'm grateful for the likes of Malcolm X and the work and the sacrifices of Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Satoshi Shakur, and everyone else, and the work that they've put in. And I'm grateful for that. And I think even though there's a long way for us to go, there have been previous revolutionary people who have been out there as leaders in the forefront movement.
Thank you. A really good answer. I think yeah. So it's about that police reform, but that's a kind of symptom of the kind of wider structure of what's wise. And yeah, I think that's a really, really good answer. I guess I had another question. Sorry, I'm kind of monopolizing the questions, but only because I'm really intrigued to kind of learn more and take the opportunity while I've got you on the call. So I guess it's on the defunding the police point. So this might be a bit of a question. So I think if I've understood the kind of defunding the police kind of policy properly from what you've said, and do correct me if I've got this wrong, I think you're saying it's kind of about early intervention. It's about shifting the funding from that kind of back end, expensive kind of police having to deal with like criminal justice and putting people through the courts and all this kind of thing, and into kind of more early intervention kind of services to prevent things getting to that point in the first place, and those kind of wider support structures in society. Have I kind of interpreted that?
Yeah, definitely. I feel like it's basically when there's an issue within our society. And I was having this conversation with a youngster who initially disagreed with the point that I was making about defunding the police, because he felt that, but that's not going to solve the problems. And I feel like the problem here is there's been huge cuts, and this is, I think, the issue within the democratic procedures in the UK, where you have a political party of one or two who are, one of them is going to win, and one has an agenda that's very, very towards the far right in terms of not supporting the people to get up and do the work that they want to do, improve their lives. And I think the issue here, in sense, is when we're talking about defunding the police, it's exactly like you said. It's not just early interventions, but it's putting in place measures where young people who are in violent situations, they have access to support. Young people, 2/3 of young people who have mental health issues have the support they need to have, so that they don't fall in this trap of being a victim of this criminal justice system that doesn't really work. And I think that's where the answer lies. When there's an issue in our society, it's for example, if there's an issue, do is we call the police. If someone's dying and needs to go to the hospital, the first thing we do, calling the police, doesn't really solve the issue. It actually causes more issues than necessary, than dealing with issues. So I think that's where, and I'd say especially within schools, rather than having more youth workers, social workers that are equipped in supporting young people to deal with the root problems that they're facing, whether that's home, whether racism within school, whether just generally feeling that they're not up to, what they need to be doing, or have this sort of pressure from peer pressure or just pressure of society as a whole, social media. The police is not going to be solving that issue. The police's job is to make sure our society is safe, but also to, catch the criminals, the real criminals. And by making people feel guilty before even being in a position of, um, dealing with the issues that they're in, it doesn't, basically policing the community doesn't support change, doesn't improve our situation within our communities. Rather, it makes the community feel as criminals when they're not. I think this relates to the prevent duty spying on Black and brown communities, people who are active within Palestine issues, or generally people who are interested in social justice, and they're made to feel as, they are guilty or even radicalized when really they're not. And I feel, for instance, prevent duty, radicalizes people when it's supposed to not radicalize people, it's supposed to de-radicalize people. And I think that's the concern with initiatives led by governments who don't understand the people they are meant to serve.
So I guess then my kind of follow-up question on defunding the police is, do you think there's a bit of a kind of branding problem for you there then, a little bit? Because I think the way you described it is really sensible. It's like, put the money where it's going to make the most impact and kind of solve problems for people. But I think if you asked probably 100 people on the street, they probably wouldn't think that's what you meant when you said defunding police. They probably think, yeah, you just want to get rid of the police and kind of not replace it with anything. So I guess, I don't know. Do you think there's a kind of a risk of harm then?
I feel this is where education comes in, because obviously for me, when I first seen defunding police, I knew it wasn't about, without having understood it, I knew it was not about basically getting rid of the police. And I feel like there's a sense of understanding, and if you want to understand, then you can understand. And for example, Keir Starmer, someone who's worked with the police, someone who's been a prosecutor, someone who's got the experience that he has, just doesn't understand what defunding the police means or have an idea, just says a lot about the recklessness in terms of understanding what the Black Lives Matter movement is actually about and the inequalities in society.
Do you think it was that he didn't understand it, or do you think basically his judgment might have been as a kind of catchphrase and as a message, most of the public might not understand it, so it's kind of difficult for him to kind of dock himself to it, because it requires quite a lot of explanation to kind of tell people. I guess the counter argument is maybe that's what we should expect our politicians should be doing, kind of doing the legwork.
Especially with, he's got the experience, he understands. He could have took the opportunity to talk about what defunding the police means, rather than praising an institution that has unfortunately, destroyed many lives because of institutional racism within the police force. And I think, especially for someone who claims to be there for, the wider population and, support, the Black community, for instance, it completely disappoints and, ignores their existence and their experiences in dealing with the police. And I think in terms of imagine if you just said, reallocate police fund. I don't think it would have been on a catchline on the newspaper or on a trend. And I think not to call it as a trend, but more in a sense to see it as, when there's £28 billion being spent, 28.6 billion pound being spent on policing the community, I think I would say definitely defund parts of that. And I think it does in some way not, in some way it does, I get where you're coming from 100%, but it does in some way, explain why we would say defunding the police, especially with that much money being spent on policing. Policing doesn't answer the social issues that people are facing.
I just wonder whether actually a kind of well, part of me thinks, well, why does it have to be? Why do we have to present it as mutually exclusive? Why do we have to say you have to take money away from here to invest at the front end when actually we're a kind of rich country and we've proven, I guess over the past few months we can conjure money if we really need it to kind of invest in things we want. So actually maybe a kind of better tactic is to say, well, invest in these things and then maybe down the line defund the police at that point. But I don't know. This is all kind of beyond my pay grade and just things that come into my head. So yeah.
I think what I would say to that, though, I think I completely understand your point, and I don't disagree in terms of renaming or whatnot in terms of the defunding the police. I think my more of a concern I think would be in terms of why is £28.6 billion being spent on policing when that amount is not equivalent to social care, to primary education, and how can we as the UK be competing with our allies or with our competitors if we spend more money on policing communities and actually in a democratic country should be supporting people in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of being able to be themselves for who they are. And I think it's not just about the wording of defunding the police. It's more about, okay, we have an issue here. The moment there's a problem, the first thing the government does is runs towards, we need to police this person, rather than this person has mental health issues. This person requires support in terms of social housing. And I think that's the approach that I would personally like to take.
That's a really good kind of really good challenge. It's about what's your balance, where's your priorities, and have we got that right? So okay, so I've got I've kind of caused the meeting to run on a lot longer than we intended, but and apologies for keeping you, Abdullah, longer than.
No, honestly, it's great. It's been a great conversation.
But I mean that's taught me a load, and I really appreciate it, and thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Inshallah, we'll see you again.
Inshallah, definitely.
Get a kind of update how things are going in a few months' time and see how the movement's progressing. Because I think one thing that I think everyone can agree on is we want outcomes to be kind of equal and kind of good for everyone in society, isn't it? And kind of any a movement that's got an aim and objective to achieve that is something that we should be getting behind. So thank you for educating us on that, and
thank you.
Inshallah we'll hear a little bit more from you at some point.
Thank you for your time.